Greetings, everyone. We're thrilled to have you join us for our latest webinar on appointment of women directors in infrastructure companies. Infrastructure is a sector of mutual interest to both India and Australia. The India Economic Strategy 2035, commissioned by the Australian government, maps opportunities and presents critical insights for Australia to strengthen its economic relations with India. Under infrastructure, the strategy identifies urban development and transport as two segments that provide good investment opportunities for Australian organizations. By investment, the strategy recommends financing infrastructure projects rather than construction or operational control by building cities or roads. Now, this means Australian companies are intended to enter the Indian market as potential investors or shareholders, which is an important step because as shareholders, they could seek good corporate governance practices on the boards of the infrastructure companies that they are investing in, including better representation of women on boards that is proportionate to their board size. India too is keen to encourage investment by Australian super funds, investors and banks in Indian infrastructure projects as stated in the Australia Economic Strategy report drafted by the former ambassador Mr. Anil Wadhwa. However, this will require Indian infrastructure companies to demonstrate greater diversity that has been shown by various studies to enhance board performance and facilitate corporate democracy. Today's discussion focuses on perspectives of women who have worked in the infrastructure sector or have an understanding of its trends to enhance representation of women directors in infrastructure governance. By doing so, they share best practices and challenges in the appointment process of women directors, along with general observations for each jurisdiction to consider, not just in their individual domestic setting, but also in a cross-jurisdictional space where investments flow from one jurisdiction to the other. Now, there is very limited data available on women directors in infrastructure given its broad nature, which reflects the need of greater research in this specific sector. Rather, the focus of empirical studies has been on construction, which is one of the primary segments of infrastructure. An information piece published in Business World observed 71.5% males enrolled in engineering or technical courses across India. From the 28.5% women enrolled, only 1 to 2% were able to reach top-level management positions, which means the chance of them for becoming executive directors is fairly slim or fairly narrowed down. Now, Dr. Karnmula's study on girls' perception of the construction industry also reports a similar concern of attracting females to Australian construction organizations, since it is perceived to have a disproportionate gender representation in the favor of males. Now, for the year 2019, the Australian Bureau of Statistics revealed 95.5% CEOs and 87.3% senior management in construction were men. Our own preliminary findings on the topic notes that the proportion of women directors of key infrastructure companies is lower than the average in both countries. However, infrastructure governance in both India and Australia differs in one key aspect, which is the influence of promoters on the appointment of directors. Now, in India, whether the promoter group comprises of family members, their trust, or affiliate companies, or whether the promoter is the government, the promoters either sit on the Nomination and Remuneration Committee, which is a subcommittee of the board themselves, or they have nominees who represent their interest on such a committee. Now, this is critical because the Nomination and Remuneration Committee is responsible for recommending directorial candidates to the board, which are subsequently considered by the shareholders in their general meeting. Therefore, who is recommended for a directorial role, including women directors, is influenced by promoters, and they are primarily males. Now, in both countries, women directors on infrastructure companies are independent directors rather than executive directors, which means that they are coming from outside the company rather than from within the company. Now, in both countries, the occupational background of such directors is law and finance rather than engineering or operations more generally, or even administrative roles such as company secretarial roles. So with this background in mind, we commence the discussion on the topic, which is on the appointment of women directors, that critically is one of the steps in enhancing the gender representation on corporate boards, particularly infrastructure, which is a masculine field. So it gives me tremendous joy to welcome our guest of honor, Sarah Storey, Deputy High Commissioner from Australia to India. As a distinguished diplomat, Sarah carries an experience of over 25 years in organizational leadership and leadership crisis. Most notable has been her engagement as advisor to the former Foreign Minister, Julie Bishop. She holds qualifications from premier institutions in business and foreign affairs, such as the Harvard Business School and the Harvard Kennedy School. I now invite Ms. Storey to say a few words.
Thank you so much, Divyangana, and it's great to be introduced by a fantastic female alumni of an Australian university. I also wanted to applaud OP Jindal Global for its significant contribution to our bilateral relationships. In fact, home to the Centre for India-Australia Studies, the first to be embedded in an Indian university and hopefully the first of many. I'm really honoured to present today's keynote address at OP Jindal Global University and to join this remarkable panel to discuss the important issue of increasing women's participation and leadership in the infrastructure sector. To put it simply, workplace gender equality is not just about fairness, it also makes great business sense. Diverse voices equal new ideas. Now, more than ever, as businesses look to a post-COVID-19 world, having women in leadership positions will be key to helping companies navigate through the COVID crisis and its aftermath. A 2020 report by Australia's Workplace Gender Equality Agency showed that having more women on boards and in senior leadership positions saw improved company performance, greater productivity, and increased profitability. The report found that having a female CEO led to a 5% increase in market value, equivalent to, on average, approximately Australian 79 million. However, despite this compelling business case, women make up just 17% of CEOs in both Australia and India. This is woefully behind and is not good for, it's woefully behind women's workforce participation. It's also below the global average of 24% of women CEOs. And I wanted to just highlight there, 17% in both Australia and India. I'm not saying that Australia has all the answers, but certainly not, because these are very similar statistics in both of our countries. In Australia, the majority of boards are still dominated by men. Only 14% of companies have a woman as their board chair, and 22% of companies have no female board representation at all. That's nearly a quarter. This number is even higher in the construction sector, where almost 70% of companies have zero female representation on boards. Strengthening women's economic security, increasing women's workforce participation, and improving women's leadership choices is a priority for us. Companies need to take action as well to promote gender equality in the workplace. Research by Australia's Curtin University shows that organisations which implemented a comprehensive suite of gender equality policies and practices and did so consistently over time, achieved lower gender pay gaps and saw women more likely to take up senior leadership roles. I believe that embedding gender equality as a standard business practice will not only drive better company performance, productivity and profitability, but it will deliver meaningful systemic change and help close the gender pay gap and make our workplaces better, fairer and safer for both women and men. I think that if we don't make these deliberate policy choices, it will take centuries, literally centuries, for the gender pay gap to be closed by market forces. If companies change their policies and practices to promote gender equality, the choices women and men make also will change. And I just wanted to point out a few strategies in which we could aim for. Firstly, targets. Organisations that set consistent targets for appointing women to boards have been shown to increase the number of female board members twice as quickly as those organisations that don't set targets. Second is flexibility. The availability of flexible work arrangements significantly increases the number of part-time female managers. Third, paid parental leave, not just maternity leave. Employer paid parental leave is crucial to supporting women to stay in the workforce after having children. Female managers are twice as likely to return to work if their employer provides 13 plus weeks of paid parental leave. Fourth, and I can't emphasise the importance of this one enough, male champions of change. Male CEOs and leaders need to use their individual and collective influence to ensure the issue of women's representation in leadership is elevated on their business agenda. And finally, leadership. Female representation on boards must have strong support from the top. Once the female representatives are there, they need to actively look to mentor and support other women. So as part of our rapidly growing bilateral cooperation, under our comprehensive strategic partnership that was agreed by our Prime Ministers in 2020, it was elevated to this comprehensive level by our Prime Ministers. Australia and India are also working towards promoting women's leadership and economic empowerment from the highest level down. Last week, as part of International Women's Day, I was pleased to launch a Women's Entrepreneurship program, a collaboration between an Australian and an Indian university. On the same day, I was a panel in Mumbai and called Partnerships for Prosperity with the Maharashtra Minister for Women, and I interviewed 4 panel members, including one trailblazer who had worked on infrastructure investments in both Australia and India. This is just a start. As the Australia-India economic relationship grows, so does our scope to jointly promote greater female representation. Infrastructure is a priority sector in our shared agenda to enhance trade and investment ties. Australia and India both have robust infrastructure agendas that drive economic development and deliver world-class connectivity to our populations. India's accelerated efforts to facilitate domestic infrastructure development presents opportunities to expand our cooperation. Over $2 trillion of additional Australian investment entered India in the 5 years to 2025. And as mentioned in the introduction, we really hope to grow this much further. We want to get Australian super funds, for instance, investing here. The recently announced Australia-India Infrastructure Forum is designed to capitalise on this opportunity and to serve as a hub to promote two-way investment. It will draw together policy, corporate and regulatory expertise, strengthen business ties and create awareness of opportunities, including for Australian investors and exporters of niche services and technology. We're looking at the moment to implement this announcement and we're working closely with NITI Aayog. And we hope to work closely with the private sector as well. All of this will create avenues to work together to promote gender equality in the infrastructure sector. I encourage you all to stay involved as we develop this bilateral initiative, and please send us your ideas. Women belong simply in all places where decisions are made. Increasing the talent pool of women working in infrastructure and creating an enabling environment to support them to take up leadership positions will ultimately lead to better decisions. As I mentioned, greater productivity and greater profitability. It just makes good business sense. We must therefore remain resolute in our efforts to promote gender equality and women in leadership. I welcome this event and I look forward to hearing from our experienced panellists and audience on ways in which we can get greater gender representation on our infrastructure boards. Institutions like OP Jindal University, with its close links to Australia, including the Centre for India-Australia Studies and people-to-people connections that they facilitate, will drive our shared prosperity. Let's work together to make that growth inclusive, and thank you again for this opportunity.
Thank you, Deputy Commissioner Sarah, for an insightful introduction to the topic. I agree setting targets is crucial for greater diversity on boards. And on this point, it is a joy to introduce our first panelist for today, Gabrielle Trainor, Chair of the Construction Industry Culture Task Force, New South Wales and Victoria, a joint initiative between the construction industry and academia to draft a new culture standard for enhancing productivity and performance in the construction sector, including representation of women in the workforce. Her impressive array of board positions include Director at Western Parkland Authority, New South Wales, Major Transport Infrastructure Authority, Victoria, and Build Australia, one of Australia's largest private construction groups. I now invite Gabrielle to share her thoughts on this topic.
Sorry, just trying to unmute. There we are, I think. Can you hear me? Hope so. It's a real pleasure to be with you here today, and it's a great privilege really to be part of a panel of such eminent people, myself excluded, to discuss this topic, which is of such importance to our two countries, to the infrastructure industry, both in India and in Australia. It's going to be wonderful to be able to share our experiences and look for solutions with like-minded people in our two countries, particularly given the close economic and cultural ties that Australia and India have. India is, of course, our greatest source of new Australian citizens, and close to 200,000 Indian migrants live in Western Sydney, where I've spent the day today, and from where I'm speaking to you now. I'm in Parramatta, and of course I acknowledge the Darug and Gundungurra people who've been the traditional owners of this land for tens of thousands of years, and I pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. They are part of the longest continuing culture on this planet. So now to the topic at hand. Well, the first thing to say is that there are many great things about the infrastructure and construction industry, both in India and in Australia. The feats of engineering, project management, design, and the physical labour that delivers our cities, our transport, our energy systems, our water, our telecommunications, our social and cultural places, and our homes. There's much to admire in the infrastructure industry. And there are so many exemplary people in the industry, which is one of our largest, as it is in India, committed to providing safe workplaces and fulfilling careers. The building and construction industry in Australia generates more than $360 billion in revenue and produces about 9% of Australia's GDP. So it is a significant industry with great opportunities. Over the past decades, there has been a commendable focus in infrastructure and construction more generally on physical safety, which has seen injury and death rates reduce significantly. But that focus in infrastructure on safety, physical safety, has not been matched by an equal focus on mental health and well-being. Suicide rates in the construction industry generally are among the highest of any. A construction worker in Australia is 6 times more likely to die of suicide than of a workplace accident. Related to that, working hours in infrastructure far exceed most other industries. The physical safety focus has also not been matched by a wider focus on workplace culture, particularly when it comes to providing an environment for women where they can flourish with the same opportunities as men. Construction in Australia is not only one of the largest, but it is the most male-dominated of any industry. It is 88% men, and you'll find 98 men for every 2 women working on a construction site. It's been that way for decades. Average diversity, by contrast, in the mining industry has put infrastructure and construction to shame. Diversity rates in the mining industry, again one of Australia's very big industries, now approaches around 20%. There's been enormous effort put into the mining industry's approach to gender diversity and inclusion. Despite a huge number of programs in construction and infrastructure run by governments, by professional associations, by not-for-profit organisations, unconscious bias training galore, science, technology, engineering and maths programs in schools. The statistics reflecting the participation of women in infrastructure remain stubbornly stuck. We recently saw that construction has the widest gender pay gap of any Australian industry. It's up to 30.6%, and it is one of only 2 industries where the gap has widened since 2013-14. And that gender pay gap in the construction industry has widened 3 times that of the other named industry whose gender pay gap has got worse. Though the scale and history of our industries differ between Australia and India, these kind of statistics from Australia are probably no real surprise to our Indian friends and colleagues listening today. They will sound broadly familiar to you. But I don't think we can dispute the proposition that it is time that this changed. It is well overdue. I've been the chair of an entity called the Construction Industry Culture Taskforce, the FAICD, for 2 or 3 years now. And our purpose is to make a step change in the infrastructure industry, not just because of the gender equity issues, not just because it's the right thing to do for mental health and wellbeing, but it's also a conversation about productivity and an urgent need to attract more women and young people to the infrastructure industry. We are facing a significant workforce shortfall against the projected requirements to meet Australia's infrastructure pipeline of about 105,000 people by next year. In Australian terms, that is a lot of people. That means projects commissioned by governments just won't be able to be completed efficiently and effectively, and labour costs are already escalating. So where are we going to find 105,000 people to fill this pipeline? We strongly believe that affordable childcare and paid parental leave are 2 of the key facilitating factors that must accompany women's greater participation in the workforce at large, including in the infrastructure industry. But our work at the Culture Task Force and the research that has underpinned it shows that accessible childcare and parental leave are not the only or even necessarily the main impediments to higher participation rates of women in the industry. One of the major turn-offs for women is the culture of the industry. An industry dominated so overwhelmingly by males tends to self-perpetuate a culture that just does not appeal to women. Unsurprisingly, and out of step with many other industries, construction workplaces are characterised by those excessive working hours, including weekends, by an inadequate focus on wellbeing, as I said, leading to shameful mental health statistics, and a failure to provide an environment where women can see a career pathway for themselves, and which in many cases fails to provide even basic amenities for women on sites. A large proportion of the small number of women who join the industry end up voting with their feet. They exit at a rate 39 times faster than men. It is not only retention that's an issue, it is still a significant need to encourage girls and women to study science and technology subjects from an early age to create a strong entry pipeline to the infrastructure industry. Our task force, the CITC, our deliberate focus is on the culture of the industry in the workplace itself. So we've brought together industry, governments, and a team of workplace academics to make a step change to the infrastructure industry. We're determined to do it. So how do we propose to do this? Well, we have developed a culture standard with which the industry will need to comply as part of the government procurement process for infrastructure projects. Our culture standard focuses on, firstly, requirements to bring excessive working hours in line with other industries. Secondly, measures to improve gender diversity. And thirdly, measures to improve physical and mental health. These 3 areas must be tackled together in an integrated way. Their negative effects on the industry are interwoven into some sort of Gordian knot, which our standard aims to untie. A study we commissioned recently has shown the costs of inaction amount to over 8 billion Australian dollars per year. The negative machismo culture of the industry takes its toll on workers and on their families, not only women workers, on men workers as well. Divorce, family violence, mental illness, substance abuse and suicide are often the products of an industry which has not paid enough attention to its culture. The correlation is striking and shameful. So having our government clients around our table at the Taskforce, at this stage, our two biggest states who both have the largest infrastructure programs, and requiring a strong focus on changing industry culture is, we have concluded, the only way to arrest what becomes a race to the bottom when bids are being put in for infrastructure projects. That race to the bottom typically involves just time and cost, where the proponents bid as the main considerations. They do not invest in culture. You can read more about the standard and the evidence base that underpins it at our website, which is cultureinconstruction.com.au. It deals with standards as basic as trying to prevent offensive material and language on construction sites and infrastructure sites, and the provision of proper amenities for women. It also, more fundamentally, requires gender equality action plans and targets as part of project procurement. Better working hours set out in the standard is a major enabler of change. I can talk more a little bit later, possibly at question time, because I can see my time is running out, about the research on women on the boards of Australian infrastructure projects. So I'll leave that till a bit later, but it won't surprise you to learn those statistics are really quite shameful, and as has been pointed out, it makes no business sense. It has been proven to make no business sense to have women on your boards. So we think without substantial and systemic change, we will continue to see the underrepresentation of women in the construction industry and the infrastructure industry in Australia, and that will continue to impact equity, wellbeing and productivity. So we think the adoption of our culture standard as part of procurement is a way to make a step change and toward providing some of those solutions. So thank you very much for listening to me, and I look forward to our discussion.
Some very critical points provided to think over, particularly safety and culture, which is a cause of concern for the Indian female workforce in construction as well. So this is a key area for both countries to really think, reflect over and work together. A culture standard is a very good step, and it is something that India at some point should also start consciously considering, since key standards and measurement techniques are not often adopted by Indian companies, let alone reporting on it. So we don't have so much data really coming up, and I think these sort of culture standards and measurements is the need of the hour. Building the discourse, particularly from the perspective of inclusion, is our second panelist, Elizabeth Shaw, partner at PwC Australia with expertise in diversity, inclusion and well-being. Her work is focused on identifying and addressing barriers to inclusion that can be addressed by the organization for stronger leadership and organizational growth. Her previous engagements include President and Board Member of UN Women National Committee Australia and Executive Director at the United Nations Association of Australia. Elizabeth has been the recipient of several awards, including Professional Service Award 40 Under 40 from the Western Australia Business News and 100 Women of Influence Award conferred by Westpac and the Australian Financial Review. Looking forward to hearing Elizabeth's views on this issue.
Thank you so much, and what a pleasure to be here this afternoon. I always think that these bilateral exchanges of ideas and discussion are just the richest way to learn and continue to evolve our thinking on these areas. So thank you so much for the invitation, and to the other panelists and participants for the opportunity to be here and to learn from you and with you. I'm also really grateful to Professor Sean Starr, who is on this call as well. In 2013, I had this tremendous opportunity to spend some time in Delhi and Hyderabad with the Australia-India Youth Dialogue, and it was just one of the most formative experiences and opportunities that I've had to be part of, and it's just given me an abiding fascination and interest in Indian people, culture, and possibly food as well, which may be less relevant, but certainly is something that I got out of my time in India that I was very grateful for. So what I wanted to do in the initial comments was talk a bit about the Australian experience, where we're up to and what in my mind has helped us move forward so far, and what some of the challenges and opportunities are when we're moving forward. So I think Sarah gave us some really great context on the Australian statistics and what we can see, you know, not only from Australia, India, but pretty much every country around the world. Representation of women in very senior executive positions and on boards is a challenge globally, with no country and no industry really yet to achieve great gender balance without intervention. And so, as Sarah said, representation of Australian women on boards is around 35% of ASX 200 companies. It actually goes down from there. We find the ASX 200 a bit more advanced than countries further down the ASX. And promisingly looking forward at the appointment rate is hovering in the early 40s. So it looks like those numbers of women directors will continue to grow over the next few years, and we're hopeful following that appointment rate keep going up, we'll move closer to gender parity. This change in the ASX 200 and other organisations around Australia and other institutions as well who are working on challenging the gender balance doesn't happen without hard work and intervention, in my experience. In Australia, we have what's called the Workplace Gender Equality Agency, AGIA. That's an organisation that requires organisations of more than 100 people to report on a range of gender equality measures. And what I would say about that is that sunshine or transparency is the greatest disinfectant. So organisations being required to report transparently about their progress against a series of gender equality initiatives is absolutely fantastic for focusing their attention on what needs to be done and making progress every year in the reporting periods that they report against. This reporting is publicly available, which I think really helps to drive behaviour. At PwC, we also use that as part of our own procurement processes, requiring us to work with organisations that have at least 30% women on their board. And that's becoming increasingly common as a lever for change across large organisations and also in government procurement practices, which is fantastic. I think organisations need to put their money where their mouth is on values. The ASX, so the Australian Stock Exchange, has also been very active in promoting workplace gender equality across listed organisations, and they have their own corporate governance principles that have really helped organisations understand what needs to be done and drive change. Gabrielle provided some incredible context on the infrastructure sector and some really harrowing statistics as well, which I won't repeat, but some of them were really, I think the one that really stuck with me is women are 39 times more likely to leave, which is pretty remarkable. So the infrastructure sector in Australia remains highly segregated, and some of the factors that Gabrielle talked about, gender imbalances, stereotypes, bias, the lack of inclusive culture, are really fundamental barriers to women's participation in the workforce and have held back women's participation and elevation to leadership roles quite significantly. The gender pay gap is also an incredibly significant issue in the infrastructure sector. And when we talk about these issues, one of the challenges that I have in the work that I do, and even in conversations I've been having today, is that the majority of people who opt in or participate in these discussions tend to be women or female representatives in organisations and female nominees from leadership teams. And actually, when you reflect on the points that Gabrielle raised about culture and workforce in infrastructure, this is not just about opportunities for women, it's about industries to act on diversity, which we know has massive dividends in terms of safety, culture, innovation, wellbeing, and productivity. So we really need to shift the conversation. So it's not a women's issue, but it's a performance issue, and make sure that these conversations are working with men and other senior leaders as well. So this is not just a problem for women to solve, because it's really a workforce issue. So Gabrielle went through a lot of the challenges in the infrastructure sector. And there are a few initiatives that we sort of reflected on. So while change is happening too slowly, there are a few promising initiatives that are seeking to increase the representation of women. The New South Wales government has a Built for Women initiative, which is a fee-free training program, providing 3,000 training places for women in trades as one example. Similar programs exist across other states and territories across Australia. The Queensland government has an initiative to increase women in apprenticeships, which has nearly doubled the number of women construction apprentices between 2010 and 2020, which is a great development. And the ACT government has recently partnered with one of Australia's major unions, the CFMEU, on the Industry Coordination Project, which is a key focus of their women's plan. And that is focusing on the retention of women, really getting into some of those cultural issues that Gabrielle talked about, working to tackle some of the male-dominated culture aspects of the construction industry and build respectful relationships in the workforce. So in terms of some of those cultural and retention issues, the hope is that programs like that being piloted and rolled out at a broader level will actually drive some of the change that's needed to retain women in the infrastructure environment. Positively, we've seen some increased rate of female appointments to the Infrastructure Australia board, which now sits at 50% women, which is a great, not only gender balanced board, but I think a reflection of where the industry should get to and a good leadership kind of shadow. So in terms of opportunities and issues that still remain that I think we need to be focusing our mind on, while there have been a lot of increased women on ASX 200 boards and moving beyond that as well, one of the challenges that we have seen is that the pool of female directors is not as broad and diverse as we would like it to be. A lot of the focus has been just on gender diversity, and I think, you know, all of the notions that we have about diversity go beyond gender and also need to extend to different cultural backgrounds, educational backgrounds, ways of thinking and ways of bringing different ideas if we are going to get the dividend of that diversity, which is innovation and creativity and different ideas around that decision-making table. So a broader conception of what diversity is really critical. Secondly, of that group of women who are being appointed to ASX 200 boards, there are a lot of the same names sitting across multiple boards. So the pool of talent isn't as broad as I suspect the talent pool is in Australia. We're finding that with women holding multiple director positions, which is not to criticise those women, and men often do as well, but there are opportunities to increase the talent pool and perhaps bring more women up and give them that director experience rather than what is perceived to be a bit of a closed club in the Australian director community. Another challenge is that when looking at women directors, a lot of the perceived necessary background is CEO and C-suite experience. And while our numbers of women on boards are needing improvement, but not as bad, as has been detailed before, the number of Australian CEOs and women in senior leadership is actually really quite bad, particularly in the biggest companies. There was a story a few years ago that there was actually more men named Peter as CEOs of Australian companies than there were women of any name, which is a pretty shocking finding. And there were a few male names that just kept coming up and were represented more than any type of women. So that sort of shows at that CEO level, there's a lot of work that needs to be done, because they are seen as key sort of board feeder positions as well. And we're still seeing a lack of gender diversity broadly in those P&L management positions, so which is a critical element of experience for board roles. And just moving now to how we sort of keep pace in the next phase of where I think we should be focusing to drive change. The first is peer-led initiatives and the power of that. So there are a couple of examples in Australia that I've done some pro bono work with that I think were really impactful. The first is the Male Champions of Change, which is now referred to as the Champions of Change Coalition, but it was conceived of by our former Sex Discrimination Commissioner, Elizabeth Broderick, and it was a recognition that if men hold the levers of power in these organisations, which at the time they did and still do, we need to be involving them in driving change on gender equality and recognising their decision-making power and influence as one of the critical levers of change. So the Male Champions of Change worked well because it sort of activated this competitive instinct amongst CEOs, getting the CEOs of Australia's most iconic organisations together, setting them the challenge of gender equality, and not pitting them against each other, but really creating almost a competitive environment of what organisations were going to commit to drive change, was such a fantastic initiative. And it's really set the standard across corporate Australia for things like flexible work and mainstreaming all roles flex, paid domestic and family violence leave, encouraging men to take parental leave, and sexual harassment policies around prevention and better responding to sexual harassment in the workplace as a few examples. So that's been incredibly positive as a sort of a standard setting organisation. Another sort of similar peer-to-peer initiative has been the 30% Club, which was started by Patricia Cross, who's a prominent non-executive director, that really worked from pulling up the representation of women on boards from about 18% to 30%. And that was achieved by conversations, one-on-one peer-led conversations with male NEDs and male chairmen about the importance of appointing women. And it was a really great example of the power of change on that individual level. Board-ready programs, so traineeship programs, expose young women to the skills and experiences that are necessary to make a difference and to build confidence in the boardroom. Targets, as Sarah mentioned and Gabrielle mentioned as well, what gets measured gets done. We're a huge fan of targets at PwC for leadership roles as well, for both women and culturally diverse candidates. It's very important to us. Public reporting, as I said, transparency is absolutely critical to moving the needle and motivating the necessary people and resources. Solving that pipeline issue of women in CEO roles and pipeline P&L roles is really important. And then creating opportunities like all-female engineering teams or projects that are female-led that really help to solve that if you can't be it, you can't see it. If you can't see it, you can't be it. Idea of, you know, role modelling and leadership and the impact of that on culture as well. So I'll stop there and let you move on, but really looking forward to the discussion and talking further.
I agree. The conversation definitely needs to shift from a gender issue to a performance issue as well, because board performance is linked very closely with diversity, particularly if you want to get dividend from diversity. And this brings us to our panelists from India. We have Neera Saggi, a very senior and distinguished infrastructure professional. Neera is an independent director on two key BSE 200 companies, formerly Bombay Stock Exchange companies, Tata Projects Limited and Honeywell Automation India Limited. She commenced her career with the Indian Administrative Services in 1980 and for 34 years worked with the Indian government and non-government stakeholders. Neera was the first elected woman president at the Bombay Chamber of Commerce and Industry. She has been one of the few women directors championing greater diversity very vocally in India and for providing women directors with adequate resources to undertake their role more effectively. She has served as the CEO of Larsen & Toubro Seawood Private Limited and Deputy Commissioner of the Jawaharlal Nehru Port Trust. I now invite Neera to take the discussion forward.
Thank you, Divyangana, and thanks for having me here. It's such a pleasure to listen to the previous speakers. I think so well Gabrielle and Elizabeth highlighted the various issues that are there in Australia, and it resounds so much that there's so much of similarity in India. So thank you for your insights. I will take this in a little different manner. Let me start the whole conversation with the macro picture. And I'm talking basically of India as it stands. As you all must be aware, the employment of women in India has recently been decreasing from 1990 till now, from almost 32% when it was in 1990, it's come down to 22%. I'm highlighting these matters because no sector can be thought of in isolation, and definitely not the infrastructure sector. Then if you look at politics, regrettably, the number of ministers that we had in 2019 has decreased by almost 10% in the number of ministers that we had in 221. Take the case of corporates. And I here got some statistics for the 100 top Nifty companies in 2021, which was compiled by Corporate Enablers, a firm which looks into these things. And we realized that out of the 100 top Nifty companies, the women IDs are 125 out of 497. That's 25%. Now, this is in spite of the one woman director that is mandatorily required to be put in any board as mandated by the government in 2013. So really, if you see beyond that, the needle has not moved much. Whatever statutorily the government wanted has been done. Beyond that, the needle has not moved. And if you really see the women chair out of these 100 companies, and they're the top-notch Nifty, which have the MNCs here, which have very illustrious groups like the Mahindras and the Tatas, Larsen and Toubro, the women chair is only occupied by 5 out of 100. And the audit and the risk committees separately. Audit committee is chaired by 6 women, and risk committee is chaired by 8 women. So it's just the mindset, because there's no regulation about it. But in spite of women doing well in finance, and like the note that was circulated to us today mentioned that women from finance and legal are being accepted, we see that still there is a hesitance to put them as the chair of the risk or the audit committee. Then women MDs are only 3 out of these 100 companies, and KMPs, there are at least 5 to 6 KMPs in every company. So out of the 500, there are only 19 KMPs, the key management personals, which have been appointed by these companies. Major infra companies like L&T have 5.29% women, and Tata Projects, with which I'm associated for the last 8 years, has 5.9%, which we have diligently brought up from 2% when I went, in 2014 to 5.9% by consistently laying targets, as Gabrielle very effectively mentioned. But there's the other end of the spectrum. The construction workers in India, the women are 50%. That is because of NREP, that is the programs that take place in the rural area, which are subsidy programs. And they are considered construction workers because they lay the roads, the rural roads, the little bunds and those various things. And that is why the number increases, because there's a target under those schemes by the government that there has to be a certain number of women. But don't forget, these are very back-breaking jobs. And these are the jobs that have been not assigned to women, that the women are participating with. And very often, I think Monisha and I both will bear to it. You see a woman worker with a shovel in her hand and something on her head, carrying about loads and loads of mud and cement, and with a child on her back. It's really not a very easy situation. So this is what I would say is where the position stands. Now, what do we do in these circumstances? So there are 2 ways I look at it. One is the macro picture, what needs to be done in India itself. And that is, that needs to be ensured to ensure that in all sectors, irrespective of it being infrastructure or housing or agriculture, how do we increase the participation of women? And those things are very common. We read about them all the time, and I will touch on them from time to time. And then, of course, there are certain which are specifically related to the infrastructure sector. So let us start with the pipeline in the infrastructure sector. First of all, it's most important to create the pipeline. And recently I have noticed that Tata Project has hired 28% female graduates over the last 2 years. Larsen and Toubro has hired 22%. There seems to be some kind of a discussion which says that women have to be hired more and more. But this is the entry level. How do we ensure that they stay on? And that is something that we have not been able to ensure. If you look at the education of women in IITs, in spite of 12% women qualifying, only 8% women joined IITs. In the last 2 years, of course, it has been 17%, it has been more. And recently, I believe the IITs have reserved 20% of seats for women students. I hope this turns the needle to some extent, but it's too new an initiative for us to be able to comment on it very strongly. So first of all, it starts with the education. And here I'm talking of the middle and the higher level. I'm not talking of construction workers. That is a different conversation that can be had some other time on the table. Now, once we increase the STEM, once we increase the number of women in the STEM, for a change today, I'm happy it's a virtual meeting. With the bad cold that I have, I would have felt very awkward being with you personally and physically. So small mercies for that. Excuse me when I cough a bit in between. So education is one thing that we have to work. The second thing is that how do we increase the number in the mid-management? And here the questions are all the same. The family support. India has to turn into a care infrastructure. We have no care infrastructure in India. The creches, the places for old people, and many, many women are moving out because they are becoming primary caregivers to their children and to their parents. After all, it's an Asian society, and this is something that the women have not been able to accept that they can move out of. And not that we want them to do it. We want to have enablers that they can fulfill both their roles effectively, if they so choose to. This makes the pipeline very leaky. And somewhere after about 5 to 7 years of their careers, they move on. They move on to become housemakers. And then, of course, many of the good companies have started some programs about getting these women back to work, women who have moved out of the workforce back to work. But while these programs have been formulated, how well have they been executed and how effective have they been? I think this is something that needs to be analyzed. There are few women who are coming back into the workforce after taking a break, because the corporate culture in India is not supporting that kind of a position, that kind of a scenario. And as a result, you will find very many women in India, highly educated, finance professionals, legal professionals, getting into their own startups. Sometimes I think these startups are an euphemism for being occupied. Small work here and there, which they can do from home, and which is not exploiting or utilizing their potential to the maximum. After this, let us take the example of the IT industry in India. The IT industry has repeatedly hired senior leaders from outside the IT industry. And as a result, the woman workforce in IT in India, in Infosys, name it, TCS, it's a much larger number than the number that exists in other sectors. So this is one area which I think we can study much more and understand how did they do it, where did they succeed and where did they not. I will give you the example of the infrastructure sector. I regularly, as a woman director, have once a year meeting with all the women in the Tata project and in the GE, the other company that I am in. GE is, of course, a more sophisticated company in the sense that there's not much happening on the field. But the point that came to me repeatedly from Tata project women was, Madam, how do we go into the field? There are no bathrooms for women. If as a single woman, I'm put on a site, at least ensure that 2 of us are put. If I'm going to stay there for 6 months, I should have another woman for not company, but with whom I can share my travails and we can work jointly together. Normally, when you have field staff, you hire guest houses for them. Now, this lady told me that in the guest house, when she comes out in the evening, when she comes back in the evening from her site, she is stuck in a room because the men are sitting outside and they are having their little jokes and they are having their little drink. Now, this woman cannot join them and be a part of it. So she comes from the field, she gets stuck in the room and she's sitting there isolated in a room in the guest house. This is not which will encourage the women to work. Then, of course, the transportation system to reach the guests, to reach the sites. And of course, also the physical safety, which has been a concern in India for some time. In addition to that, other points that this is a masculine job, it is a masculine sector, it is not safe, it is backbreaking. But the point is, when you make your women work as a manual labor in a construction site, you don't worry about it being backbreaking But when you want her as a supervisor, or you want her, as a fitter on the site, then you find it's backbreaking and it's not conducive to her. It's double talk because we are not able to do it. Another example which I give from time to time, India's corporate did an excellent job, I'm sure even Australia did that, to work from home during the pandemic. And the question that I ask repeatedly is that why did it take a pandemic for us to put in systems to work from home? Why, when for the last 5-6 years, women were asking for flexibility, it was equally effective to work from home or fairly effective to work from home, why were the processes not set? Why did we do it when the men also needed it? Their physical and their health was at stake. And within 6 months, all companies were ready to ensure that we can work from home. So that just shows the mindset of how we do it. Another 1 or 2 things I would say is that there's provision for board position for women members from the government. Why is there no dictate, or rather no statutory requirement that at least so many of women executives should also move on to the board position? If they do it, if the government does it, the corporates will start putting women into top positions because they know they have to fill a board position with a non-executive director, with an executive director, which there is no compulsion to do today. So either they bring in an independent director, which the government dictates or has stipulated, or they bring in their own wife or their sister or their daughter because they feel more comfortable with it. To the question that why women are so few, let me put it clearly. Founders and promoters, even the CEOs, have a lot of men friends. They don't have many lady friends. Not that I'm encouraging that or saying that in any sense. But what I mean is that social mixing is so much lesser. So where do you find more women directors from? They don't have visibility unless they are a few, which all the other corporates have them on their board. And it's much easier to pick them up to fill in the statutory requirement. 19 women out of the 100 that I mentioned, 100 companies, are NRC chair. So it is for them now, I think, to many of them, and there are other members of NRC, women members, to ensure that they enhance the advancement of women in corporates, in infrastructure, through mentorship, sponsorship, professional networks, quality training, again, very important quality training, ensure that beyond the stereotype that they should be only in HR and finance, ensure that put the targets that why not in the engineering? Why not in the supply chain? Why not in planning and project control? And of course, definitely, why not on the site? I would just like to say that, regrettably, unlike Australia, the unemployment in India is very high. The requirement to have women in the workforce is not there. Even if we don't have any women in the workforce, there are sufficient men who can fill all the positions, and still there will be a surplus, and still there will be unemployment. Now, keeping this in view, how do you handle a scenario where the women are given their due, not only in the infrastructure, able to fulfill their aspirations and fulfill their potential? How do we support that? Is something that needs to be analyzed again and again. And the whole macro scenario has to be addressed, while certain specific areas in the infrastructure need to be handled and addressed. Thank you.
Thank you so much for introducing me to a new word, care infrastructure. And I think we should definitely adopt this term to incorporate suggestions made by our panelists today. Some very interesting and important observations have been made by our panelists. A very systematic and information presentation there, Neera. Thank you so much for that. Some crucial statistics that we also need to reflect over, not just in academia, but also in the policy sector. I think a greater push will probably need to be considered as far as policy is concerned, both within the company, that's corporate policy, but also governmental policy. The stark divide within the workforce in construction is something that clearly stands out. We've got larger number of women in field jobs, perhaps because of, again, government policy, than in management roles. That still hasn't really garnered the attention of policymakers yet. So this is something that clearly, is a red flag for policymakers to consider. So this brings us now to our fourth panelist for today, Monisha Macedo, an independent director at LTIDPL IndvIT Services Limited, which is an investment manager to IndvIT, a SEBI-registered infrastructure investment trust sponsored by Larsen & Toubro, with investments from the Canada Pension Plan Investment Board, CPPIB, Allianz Capital Partners, and the Ontario Municipal Employees Retirement System, or OMERS. Prior to this role, she served as a whole-time director with the Noida Toll Bridge Company Limited, credited with successfully maintaining and operating an advanced toll collection facility in India for over 15 years. I now invite Monisha to take the discussion forward.
Good afternoon and good evening, everyone. I hope you can hear me. I would like to thank the OP Jindal Global University, the Center for India-Australia Studies, and Vahura for inviting me to address this webinar. Frankly, when Divyangana first approached me to speak about my personal experience as a woman serving on a board of an infrastructure company, I have to admit I was not sure how I would add value to the topic of this webinar. But she was very convincing, so I guess you'll have to hear me out for 10 minutes. After a bachelor's degree in economics from St. Stephen's College in Delhi University, and to give you some perspective, I graduated around 4 years before Dr. Manmohan Singh started opening up the Indian economy in 1991. I went on to qualify as a company secretary. My initial choice of career was based on my father's advice that as a company secretary, I would be able to manage my work-life balance better when I did decide to have a family. I didn't question my father's wisdom, and it held me in good stead while my children were small. I have worked for most of my career with the ILFS Group, a pioneer in privatization of infrastructure and the largest in India in terms of asset size before its collapse in 2018. I began my stint with ILFS in the capital markets division, dropped off when I was having my first child, and was called back to join a select team setting up the first private sector road project with commercial funding. It was a listed company. And because they had experienced my work ethics, ILFS signed me on with flexible working hours, which worked extremely well for me. It was an unusual arrangement even for them, but they stuck by it, and I made sure my performance did not suffer. ILFS did not have a conscious policy to address gender diversity in the workplace. Frankly, in those days, I'm not sure if any Indian corporates did, but there always seemed to be a healthy gender balance in the junior and mid-levels. It was at the senior and board level positions where women were fewer and far between. I worked there for almost 20 years. I took just a month off after delivering my second child, and during my rise up the corporate ladder, most of my early promotions and pay hikes were more or less on track and merit-based. And it was only when I was reaching senior executive positions that I did feel something was amiss. Frankly, I never identified it as a gender bias, but it certainly was a struggle. The opportunity of an executive board position came up only with the introduction in 2015 of a statutory requirement for a listed company to have a woman director. And even then, the provision was, once it was introduced, the group started searching outside the organization for an independent woman director, rather than look internally for a likely candidate. At that time, I was managing operations and essentially every aspect of the company other than the finance function. However, the independent chairman of our board, who had worked with me for several years, stepped in and presented my case to the promoter group, and they agreed to take me on as a full-time director. I happened to be at the right place at the right time. As we all know, the infrastructure sector in India has been known for its corruption, especially in the road sector. And I was shielded from that in the corporate environment that I worked in and in my role as a professional. But with the current emphasis on infrastructure growth in India and its requirement for large and patient capital, foreign participation is a necessity and inevitable. I firmly believe that foreign investment will bring with it international standards of corporate governance, including an improvement in gender diversity and the need for professionally run organizations with high standards of ethics. This should automatically open up opportunities for women to enter sectors like infrastructure and areas of work which were so far considered unsuited for them. After I left ILNFS in 2015, it was the foreign investors in my field who recognized and appreciated my experience and emphasis on integrity. I was invited to take up a position as independent director on the board of a Canadian pension fund promoted growth sector infrastructure investment trust. It's called an IndvIT. This board is at the other end of the spectrum compared to boards I was familiar with, especially with respect to gender diversity of members, emphasis on governance, effective board functioning. Each member brings to the table experience relevant to the business, and it is a board with a majority of independent directors where 3 out of 8 directors are women. Now, coming to my experience on the Nomination and Remuneration Committee, I have found that while hiring for CXO positions, women's CVs don't come up to the committee, which confirms what everyone's been talking about. It's a lack of qualified pipeline. There is also a lack of diversity at the middle management level. However, there is awareness of the situation, a willingness to change, and to make a concerted effort to improve diversity in future hires. Notably, while there are women in admin and secretarial and assistant roles, they don't have the necessary skills to be moved into the mainstream managerial roles, which would lead to the board and hence the gap. I would like to share a few of my learnings from my career with the hope that it will benefit some of the students who will be watching this while working towards board positions. One of my main challenges is trying to break away from being labeled as a company secretary, and this would apply even to other professionals like legal or HR. I was advised by a dear friend who had headed a multinational in India that I would have to break through the glass ceiling within the organization by moving into an operational role. Being a company secretary by profession, I found it difficult to move into operations. You play a statutory role, you're attending board and committee meetings, you're involved in fundraising, restructuring, but until you get your finger on the pulse of the business and have a handle on the financials, you're not considered for a CEO or a COO position. From my experience, I asked, and it worked. Another essential aspect which has been mentioned by most speakers is skill development beyond your educational qualifications. In order for women to move into the boardroom, planned and focused training, inclusion, and exposure needs to be undertaken throughout the course of their career. And as everyone knows, that's a challenge for women, and they need mentors and sponsors. However, what I have found is that you can continuously educate yourself at the workplace by taking initiative and showing interest. It is important to specialize in your sector of choice, pick up knowledge about sector-specific issues, regulations, business strategy, risks, and of course, the main accounting and tax principles which apply to your organization. One has to go beyond your area of expertise. It is also equally important to consciously build a network of connections within your sector of choice. Via seminars and conferences, taking advantage of the platform your organization provides. I must confess, I didn't make much time for this aspect during my career, but I can see the advantages. Another issue mentioned in Divyangana's email was the language barrier. Now, government is a major stakeholder in infra. I worked with an organization which had a concession contract with the UP government. And while dealings with senior public officials was mostly in English, the rest, sometimes even correspondence, was in Hindi. And this can be a huge challenge considering our country has over 100 languages. So I would like to conclude with 2 major points. Throughout my career, I consciously included women in my team, not because I was trying to give them an opportunity, but I found women to be committed, conscientious, hardworking, focused, and yet multitaskers. Women also make efficient use of their time because they have responsibilities at home to get back to. with the appropriate guidance and handholding, it is possible to build a pipeline. You have organization like the ladies' arm, women's arm of FAICD. They're ideally positioned to provide the required training and career counseling. They could even build a database available to organizations. Secondly, we are already an over-regulated country. Over time, most corporates tend to mechanically comply rather than follow the spirit of the law. And focusing on building awareness of the advantages that women bring to the table. And I've been hearing all the speakers, and then, Dr. Fitzsimmons, another speaker in one of your webinars, has actually done a study of it. And as incentivizing corporates to provide support facilities like childcare, etc., in my opinion, would make much more of an impact than adding too many regulations. Thank you.
Thank you there, Monisha, for sharing your anecdotal experiences with the infrastructure sector. I think this is very crucial as well, to really hear out what really is happening with women directors who are on the job. What sort of challenges, opportunities, barriers are they facing day to day? Is the story very similar to what we're actually reading in the newspapers or in the media, or is it something which is entirely different? So having that personal perspective being brought out to the forefront, I think will add to some of the statistical information that we've got, or the data that's been collected, and really see, where do we need to make changes. So I think this perspective was very crucial to be brought out. And I really thank you there for sharing that experience and for giving us your time. We now move on to the question and answer session. For the question and answer session, one very, interesting aspect that I've really been considering is, in Australia, there are various measures to assess diversity and inclusion in a company, such as participation in the Diversity Council of Australia's Work Member Index that enables comparison with national benchmark. However, tracking diversity and inclusion is voluntary. The question is, how successful have infrastructure companies been in implementing measurements of diversity, and how have these companies acted upon them for enhancing gender representation in leadership and board roles? And this question, of course, is open to our panelists from Australia.
Gabrielle, did you want to go first with the sort of specific infrastructure perspective, and then I can sort of give a more general perspective after that?
Of course, very happy to do that, Elizabeth. Yes, look, I think it is difficult, particularly for private companies, and many infrastructure companies in Australia are private. I think the larger international listed companies have the regimes that the ASX has around it, that companies like, organisations like AGIA have around it. The ASX's regime requiring listed companies to record their women in leadership positions year on year on a sort of if not, why not basis has been very, very successful. But if you're a private company in infrastructure, that really isn't going to capture you. And I referred earlier very briefly to a study that we at the Culture Taskforce have done, which looked at the top 16 Australian infrastructure companies, some of which are international, and 30% of them have women on their boards, but 70% don't. And if you look at women in executive roles, senior executive roles, and this excludes the non-traditional. This includes the non-traditional roles, because of course many companies have women, as has been described in the commentary tonight, in general counsel roles or HR, corporate communications. These are the traditional roles, but in P&L responsible roles, the total of women in these 16 companies was 0. So there's no requirement of these companies to report their gender diversity roles. Save that, now I think clients, particularly government clients, are asking these questions, and there really is a war for talent. I think companies now are recognising that they do need to change the culture and infrastructure. That's not going to happen easily without getting more women involved, because women certainly do move the dynamic within companies, and it becomes a bit of a virtuous circle if you get women in senior positions, particularly with P&L responsibility. They have the credibility to make change, and they have the credibility and the power and the influence to include more women and more diverse groups more generally into the senior roles. And of course, if women are on boards, they too tend to champion involvement of more women. There are some men who are doing this, of course, and that's a point very well made earlier in this discussion, that this shouldn't be seen as secret women's business that is purely the province of women to fix, that it absolutely belongs in everybody's bailiwick to make sure that we're addressing this. And it makes, as we've heard and as we know, very, very cogent business sense to involve women in senior roles. But it is the private companies in the infrastructure space. In fact, I've just joined the board of one of them, but I'm the only woman. And, it is quite a solitary experience being the only woman in an all-male board environment. We used to say that 1 woman is a token, 2 is a conspiracy, and it's only 3 when you get a change in the dynamic in the boardroom, and therefore the beginnings of cultural change from the top of organisations. So there is still quite a lot of work to do. The infrastructure industry is lagging. That is the reason why the culture standard is requiring companies who are tendering for government work, government infrastructure projects, to record what they are doing to promote gender diversity, and record and set targets for women in decision-making positions, not just overall in the workforce, because that can tend to be made up of much more junior, clerical, administrative, those kind of positions. Not so much on the sites, as we've heard, as happens in India. That's a very different phenomenon to what prevails in Australia. But women in decision-making positions are where the needle is going to be moved, and we have various ways of working toward that, and we are making progress.
I think from the data perspective, we've talked a lot today about, what are some of the indicators of gender equality in organisations, and we've talked about the percentage of women in leadership roles and on boards, and some other measures as well. So things like part-time or flexible work as a percentage of workplace, paid parental leave policies and the percentage of women that return from parental leave, and the gender pay gap. There's 2 areas that I think are really important focuses for organisations moving forward that we're starting to see increased pickup around. The first is measuring inclusive culture. So Gabrielle talked a lot about the challenges of cultures that exclude women and are very male-dominated in infrastructure. And being able to measure the inclusive culture of an organisation is really critical, because it's often a leading indicator as to whether women and other diverse groups will stay or leave an organisation. So organisations are increasingly adding questions and evolving their annual culture surveys and doing things like kind of regular monthly 2 or 3 question cultural check-in to have a bit of a closer look at organisational culture, particularly when there's been some experiences of issues. So things like whether people feel included, valued for who they are, they feel that there's a positive diversity and inclusion environment, and they feel psychologically safe to raise any issues or call out behaviour, are really critical cultural and inclusive indicators. And the second is sort of more of a current state analysis into organisational data. So for a lot of organisations and working in diversity and inclusion, it's amazing how common people invest in all of these interventions and initiatives that aren't actually based in evidence as to what the issues are in an organisation. And the most effective thing we do with organisations is we go and look at their data. So we go and analyse their employee data, and it's actually pretty easy on gender because all organisations have that. Other aspects of diversity aren't always captured in employee systems. But looking at where women are dropping out of that pipeline and what are the pain points in organisations. So depending on the data in organisations, you can see, are women applying for certain jobs or are they not applying? What stage of the recruitment process are they getting to, and what's happening to them at that particular point that might see them not progressing further? What areas of the business are doing well and what might be potential hotspots for discrimination or bias? Are women participating or given access to training and learning and development or stretch opportunities at the same rate as men? What's happening in the promotion process, and are there any biases or issues that need to be worked out there? And what does the retention and exit interview data tell us as well on why women might be exiting organisations? So those two areas from a data perspective, I think, are really critical in starting to move the needle on some of that sort of attraction, retention and promotion gender equality issues that we have been talking about today.
That's a very interesting insight, particularly the last point on data, and gathering employment data to find out what are the trends, when are women exiting the company. As far as India is concerned, we don't really have so much emphasis on this particular employee data when it comes to really making these critical decisions. So the question then for the Indian panelists is, should the Indian government implement a national diversity index as a benchmark for senior and board level roles? And further, should it be mandatory for listed companies to measure diversity within their companies and provide a report on it in their annual report? And the reason why perhaps the suggestion is towards a government regulation that is mandatory is because in the past, when it comes to other initiatives, let's say corporate social responsibility, or even a push towards having a one-woman director, it was largely undertaken through hard legislation or hard law. So should that be the case when it comes to really measuring diversity within companies in India?
I think it's a diversity index is very much needed, and I would say not just in the middle or senior levels. You should start right from the beginning. Otherwise, you'll not be able to figure out if there's a pipeline being created. And as companies can report it in their corporate governance reports, which is half yearly or quarterly. It doesn't have to be just in the annual report, which hardly anyone reads. But I think it's very important and will make a lot of difference. Neera?
While this is a very important step and the government should take it, the emphasis has to be more. It has to be driven a lot by the funders, by the other stakeholders, who are funding the company. And also, I think to a very large extent, organizations like CII, FAICD have a big role to play to ensure that their members are, more and more participating in gender diversity. It has to be a very all-inclusive effort. My only one challenge is that how do you position this activity? For example, I have heard so many people tell us that because after pregnancy, the rules are so strict that you have to give maternity leave and you have to have creches, that it is actually becoming a deterrent for companies to have women in their employment. So being able to structure a regulation effectively is the most important thing. Getting numbers and placing it on the website is just one part of it. But really, what is it that will lead to the increase in numbers? And how effectively is that statutory or regulatory regulation positioned, that it does not become negative or adverse, but really becomes a support enabler for the women to participate in the workforce.
Yes, I completely agree, that we really have to think about how this is going to be structured in terms of a regulation, whether it should be hard law, whether it should be soft law, what should be included when it comes to measurement standards. It shouldn't just be a numeric figure that is being reported upon, but is not actively and consciously being followed. And you're absolutely right. And also directing attention towards not just the directors of the company, but also those stakeholders that are supporting the company, they should proactively be pushing for change as well, which is the shareholders and the promoters. Which brings us to the next question, really, that in India, promoters and executive directors have been observed to be members of the nomination and remuneration committees, which is responsible for recommending directors to the board. Now, given their influence in the company, even if they're not on the NRC, but let's say they're there as the chair on the board, or if they are present as a director, whether as a non-executive director or executive, so they do have an influence in the company. Should promoter responsibilities be codified in India? And second, should it include a positive obligation to consider diversity within the organization as a part of the fiduciary duty to consider the best interest of the company?
Will you take it, Monisha?
But I'll give you my short feedback on this. I think we are very familiar with Indian promoters and their behavior from, the regulation being changed and their wives and sisters got on, or, daughters got on to the board. So I think that's frankly not going to work from our Indian promoter point of view. And if Neera will also know, board appointments in India are not really professionally done. It's through a reference, right? It's not like they're going to a headhunter to look for someone. So I don't think the promoter angle would work. But what will work, and that's my personal opinion, is that when foreign investment comes into India, it comes with certain practices and standards. And that is what is going to work. And infrastructure has to move that way. We can't carry on the way we are with a promoter-driven company. So that I think is going to make a difference. Neera, do you agree?
Thanks, Monisha. I agree with what Monisha said. You see, why do you assume that the promoters and the CEO are not women-friendly and the others are? It's not so. It is the culture and the mindset of a person to person. And it might so happen that the chairman of the NRC, even if he or she is an independent director, I hope it's not a she who's indifferent, but the chairman of the NRC, he might be indifferent to this whole cause all by itself and might bring in again his buddies inside. So it's the culture. It's the culture surrounding the company and the people who are associated with it that is so important. And it has nothing to do with founders or CEOs as such. And the second important point here is that NRC might put 2 or 3 women at the top, but who's going to ensure that they survive? Who will ensure that atmosphere is such that they're able to put in their best foot forward? If it is done against the wishes, or rather with the animosity, that's too strong a word to use, but the animosity of the senior management or the founder, she's going to find it very difficult, a very Herculean struggle to be able to survive in the company. So it has to be a cultural and a mindset shift backed by regulation as far as possible. It makes a difference. Now, women directors are well accepted. At least men say that they're very happy to see them on board. But, why is Monisha laughing? But yes, you have to push it through regulation, but you can't take it to a level where it doesn't work.
Yeah. Yes, absolutely right. I do agree on the point that, corporate governance in general is about behavior of different stakeholders and their interactions and relationships with each other, and how these relationships are managed is something that we really need to treat upon very carefully. And very pertinent points raised also there, that we cannot simply assume that promoters are not friendly towards having women on boards. But of course, one method that perhaps could be considered is if promoters became a little bit more proactive, more generally. But yes, we do need to be careful and sensitive as to how we proceed when we consider the relation of promoters vis-a-vis NRC and gender diversity. Another very pertinent point that Monisha had raised was about foreign companies investing in India, and they bring about a change in corporate governance. Now, we do have subsidiaries of foreign companies, particularly an example that comes to mind is the Macquarie Group from Australia that is invested in Indian road infrastructure, both long-term and short-term. So investors in Indian infrastructure include Australian and Canadian companies. They include superannuation funds and pension funds. Now, what techniques can foreign companies and investors adopt to enhance social value creation in infrastructure of emerging markets and go above and beyond just the financial stake? And this is from both perspectives. So we're happy to hear the Indian perspective, and we're happy to hear even the Australian perspective as to what they should be considering when they are investing in overseas markets.
I might, if I may,
yes.
just mention that it's very interesting to me that you've talked about Macquarie Infrastructure, which is one of the largest infrastructure investors in the world. I'm sure everybody knows that, an Australian-based company, because we have been talking to them about the culture standard. They really like to be seen, and certainly are seen, as leaders in environmental, social and governance principles, and they are quite interested in looking at our culture standard as a procurement tool. So I think that is going to happen more and more. And I think the other point that I think it was Monisha made was certainly it used to be the case that board positions in Australia were, under the old school tie at the Australian club, someone to get a tap on the shoulder to one of his friends that he'd been at school with, and that's how the board appointment system worked. But it has become much more professionalised in Australia now. And I think this will inevitably happen in India. It might take some time, but it will happen. It's very rare for a board position to be made in Australia now for a large company or a government company, a government entity as well, without a proper headhunting process, a recruitment process, and an interview process. And of course, the recruiters are very keen to put forward women. It's good for business, as we know, and they uncover some great women. Occasionally you'll see a woman promoted into a role for which she's not quite ready, and that's unfortunate when it happens. And I think it was Neera who made the really good point that women who are appointed to these kinds of roles need to be set up to succeed, and they do need the support. They'll have the skills, they may not have the confidence immediately, but they certainly need to be looked after in these roles so they can succeed and be their best, put their best foot forward in them, and be role models to other women.
And it's a very, very interesting point there that, Macquarie is interested in the culture standard. And I think that will really have an impact as far as gender representation is concerned. And what about our panelists from India? What are their thoughts on foreign subsidiaries coming in? Would that really impact, corporate governance in India and the standards here?
So I've found that a lot of the foreign investment that's coming in right now is very keen to be actively involved in the management of, and at the senior level of whatever their investment is. They don't leave it to, the Indian counterparts. So yes, and when they're looking at corporate governance regulations that we have in India, they actually follow them in spirit. And frankly, when you're coming in with such large investments, you can put your foot down that everything has to be done, according to the law. And I think, it makes sense. Neera, would you like to add to it?
Yeah, I would agree with you, Monisha. But however, it also depends on which country the investment is coming. There are certain countries which bring in their own cultures, and that might not be as conducive to gender diversity or social scenarios. But this definitely where the processes and the procedures are concerned, the foreign companies that are coming in have set a much higher standard because they have a very strong supporting staff which has been interacting throughout the world, and they've put processes and procedures in place, which becomes a benefit to us when these companies come to India. So in almost all the MNCs, not almost, in all the MNCs that I have been associated with, GE, Honeywell, IndvIT, where Monisha and I both are together, it is definitely a very strong process that is in place. Whether they definitely support the gender agenda, the social agenda, I think that also to some extent depends on the person who's been the CEO here, who's been put here, and what is his mindset. Divyangana, I would be 2 points I felt we missed out in the webinar today. One was, I think, the role of the press. If you can just give me a second to talk about it, especially in view of the recent incidents, in India. Gabrielle and Elizabeth, I don't know if you're aware of it, but two of our very high-profile women CEOs and MDs have been under some kind of a scrutiny because of things that have, seem to have happened in the board. Fair enough, let law take its own course. But what has happened is that at times, press has to some extent highlighted on their personal lives and on their friendships with people within the organization, which is absolutely unnecessary and uncalled for. What is required is that if they didn't perform their job well, and for whatever reason, fair enough, everyone has a right to know and go into the depth of it. But the relationships, whether within the company or outside the company, or their holidays outside or within the country, are absolutely of no concern, which unnecessarily the press has played upon. And because it's a woman, I have seen, even if such misdoings in inverted commas, because things are not proved, but even misdoings are done by men, somehow when it happens for women, because they are so few, and when they were in the acme of their profession, in their job, the spotlight was on them so strong that it becomes something that everyone takes interest in and becomes almost like the, trash paper incidents which are narrated from time to time. This is something that is very worrying and is a handicap for women to come in any sector. And the second thing is, while I mentioned the IT industry, the public sector in India has done excellent job with women. SCI, NOSIL, there are so many organizations where women have gone to the top. They are in CFO position, they are in KMP positions. I think we need to study that in more detail. And I have done both the public and the private sector. I spent the first 30 years of my life in the Indian Administrative Service, and I can tell you, government is a very good employer for women. I think they're the best employers for women than anyone else. And, I speak of it from experience. So this is another aspect which we are all missing out in most of the webinars and seminars that we're talking about, because they have a lot to teach us. And how have they done it? Sorry for, diverting from what you asked me. But since, all this was going on in my mind, I thought I'll mention it.
No. I'm really glad that you brought this to the forefront, because the purpose of the webinar, in fact, is to have a discussion on some of these critical issues that are that women directors in infrastructure are facing. And it's important to have this conversation and bring to the limelight what is it that they're facing. So I'm very, very glad, Neera, that you've been able to highlight the role of the press and, employment in general when it comes to the infrastructure industry. A very stimulating discussion we've had today, and I'm very, very conscious of the time. Which I think, of course, it sets the stage for policy discussions in each jurisdiction. As we find insights coming from the infrastructure industry, it becomes imperative for companies and the government to address concerns of better representation of women from strategic to operational levels in the company, particularly infrastructure, because regardless of how one defines it or how you bring companies within the ambit of infrastructure, it is still a significant employer in each jurisdiction, whether it is transport infrastructure, utilities, or construction. It is a cause of concern for both India and Australia from a gender parity perspective, and also from the purview of enhancing board performance, especially in infrastructure, if companies us falling behind in having women strategic decision makers from both within as well as outside the company. Now, while infrastructure companies more broadly have been able to improve representation of independent directors, women executive directors and C-suite roles need to be seriously considered and enhanced. Similarly, diversity in occupational background of women directors is the need of the hour, particularly for the operational segment, which involves increasing women in the technical workforce more generally. So while you do have independent directors at the board level, and if you're looking at the field work, you do have women in both countries at the field level. If you're looking at that mid-tier level, there is still a gap. And this really needs to be discussed. Now, the insights shared by the panelists have been invaluable in highlighting some of the concerns in this issue, and we thank them for their invaluable time and views. We're also very grateful to our project partners and the Australian government for supporting our work in the area of enhancing gender representation on boards. Of course, this webinar particularly focused on the appointment of women and the role of the NRC. Last but not the least, we thank the audience for patiently listening to us. Now, we're happy to receive any parting comments or views from the panelists, and thereafter we may close the webinar. And any last minute comments that the panelists have.
I think all I would say is just to really reiterate the importance of all aspects of society working together holistically to solve gender inequality. So I think there's a really important role for business to play. I think there's an important role for government to play. And I think that there's an incredible power of individuals and peer-to-peer initiatives as well to drive change. So I think in reflecting on what really drives widespread cultural and institutional change, it's a combination of those three.
Yes, I do agree with that. Yes, that, you know, it needs to be a holistic effort coming in together.
Yes, I agree with that. And I might just finally say too, what a pleasure it's been to be part of this panel and to meet Monisha and Neera and Elizabeth and Sarah. And thank Divyangana and Sean very much for the opportunity to be part of tonight's proceedings. As far as the infrastructure industry goes, it's wholesale systemic change that is required at all levels in Australia, and I think in India, to really create the opportunities for women to be in positions of influence, whether it's the board or senior management, and the culture of the whole industry has to be looked at holistically. We can't just look at programs for gender diversity. We can't just look at programs for health and wellbeing. We can't just look at reducing working hours or making them more family friendly. It has to be tackled holistically to really make a difference, make a step change. And I hope we're well on the way to doing that here in Australia. But it's been a pleasure meeting you all tonight. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much for taking out time and for sharing your insights. I think the culture standard is a novelty in itself, because I know that in India, we haven't really come across such a proactive measure coming from, governments collectively. So we're definitely looking forward to the culture standard coming in, how it's going to be adopted within the industry. So definitely do keep in touch, and we would love to hear more.
We will. Well, the great thing about it is that industry is part of it as well. It is a real collaboration. It's not government imposing a regulation. It is everybody working around the table to say, how can we do this better?
Absolutely. And I think that works wherever there is a collaborative environment. I think that seems to work rather than an imposition on the industry or the people. So definitely, I think this is a very good step and also in the right direction. Of course, I am very conscious of the time now. So I think we can wrap up if there are any last minute comments or anything, if the audience wants to say anything. All right, so I think we can close the webinar. Thank you. Thanks everyone so much for joining in. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you. Thanks to everyone. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank
That was
you.
wonderful. I'm running late for school pickup, so I'm off. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.